Hey everybody, welcome. My name is Sam Hill. I'm a team leader at the Rocket Company. I've got Matt Adair with me. We're here to talk about how to develop your church's volunteers today. Something that every church needs, a strong volunteer base. You can't grow without volunteers. Volunteers are hard to get, they're hard to keep. And so we're going to talk about all that today. As you're joining us today, I want you just to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, your name, and where you're located so that we can say hi to you. Thanks for taking a few minutes of your valuable time to be with us. Matt, say what's up, man.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hope you're doing well today.
We are fired up. Matt and I go back. We both are Bulldog UGA fans. Football season is like 39 days away, something like that.
Yep.
Last I was keeping track. So we're getting real close. And today, just introduce yourself. There is a chat box on somewhere on your screen, I think on the right-hand side, and just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. Tell us where you're from, and we're so excited you're here. We're going to talk about how to develop, how to train, how to grow and sustain your volunteer ministry at church, which is so vital. We say Gershon Gordon is here in Belleville, Texas. Welcome. Glad to have you. Thanks for being here. Hey, if you're just arriving, my name's Sam Hill. I'm a team leader with the Rocket Company. I have Matt Adair here. You've arrived in the right place. If you're looking for free content, free information, free training, we're here to invest in you so that you can grow your volunteer base at your church, something that every church has to have to grow. And Matt Adair is going to get off some great content today. Joel is here. Tom and Robert from Florida. Wow, Bill is here. The people are flying in. Rick Christie, thank you for being here. Michael, Helene, Joni Holman. All right, welcome. Los Angeles, Texas, Florida, all over the place. As it is with the Rocket Company, it's always an international event. I mean, all of the United States stops, right, and people just flock to these events, right? I'm totally kidding, but we're really glad you're here. We're going to begin in just about 2 or 3 minutes and talk about how to grow volunteers. You know, here's the thing with volunteers, okay? A lot of churches, church leaders, they either have one of three mentalities when it comes to volunteers. If you're a church leader, you might be the Lone Ranger, okay, which is where you're doing it all at your church, and you don't have a band with you at all joining with you to help you grow and push and grow and move ahead, and so you're a Lone Ranger, right? And you feel like you're doing it all the time. Or you're chaos, okay? So you've got a lot of volunteers in the game, but it's total chaos. You got a lot that came on quickly, so nobody's really organized. You don't really feel like you have your hands around it, which can be concerning at times, and you just feel stressed and like, wow, I'm glad I have volunteers, but I sure wish I knew what to do with them, okay? Or you're in bucket number 3, which is had the churn and burn, you know, where you've had leaders and you were able to recruit them early on, and you kept them for a while, and then they disappeared, you know, kind of the turnstile volunteer. And the reason why I care about volunteers so much is because I've actually been through some of those different cycles myself. And I was a volunteer at a church, and I got burned out. I'd been at a church that was a church plant, and we needed volunteers so bad, but we couldn't get anybody to help out. And so this is so important because every church has to have leaders to grow. You can't do anything by yourself for the long haul. You've got to have people in it with you. The problem is you can't pay everybody, right? Volunteers are free, so they've got to really want to be a part of this to move ahead. So we're excited you're here. Joy is here. Brianna is here. Lynette, welcome everybody. Larry, Rusty, Lenny, Gary, Bishop Yokefellow from Indy, welcome. We're so pumped up that you're here. Go ahead, introduce yourself. If you're just arriving, you've arrived in the right place. This is the Rocket Company webinar on how to develop your church's volunteers. My name's Sam Hill. We're going to begin in just about 1 minute here. Is with us. I'm going to ask Haley, who is going to facilitate questions, to just launch that screen share if you can, so they can see Matt's smiling face and they know where the content is going to be coming from. We are pumped you're here. Stephen is here. Jim, Cameron, Mike, Ben, Tim. Holy cow, John, Randall, man, we're so excited you're here. Pennsylvania, Mississippi, Arkansas, Illinois, Phoenix, New Mexico, Brian from Trinidad, welcome, welcome, welcome. Hey guys, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Sam Hill, and I'm a team leader at the Rocket Company. And the Rocket Company exists to invest in you, right? Church leaders spend their lives, spend their days pouring themselves out for everybody else, but sometimes there's not anybody investing in them. And the Rocket Company exists to do that, invest in you. So we do trainings like this to help you in the key areas of your ministry, your church, so that you can grow. And so today, Matt Adair is going to talk about how to develop your church's volunteers. I shared earlier, there's kind of three people. There's the Lone Ranger church leader who's got nobody at his side helping him or her grow, and so you feel alone. You've got chaos, right, where you've got volunteers like crazy. It's an awesome thing, but nobody's organized, and you just feel like your head's spinning, you're stressed, you don't know what to do with everybody. And then number three, maybe you've had volunteers in the past, but they've burned out, they're gone. Put a 1, the number 1 in the chat box if you fall into one of those categories. Put a 1 in the chat box if you need more volunteers to grow your church, to move ahead, to sustain what you're doing. Put a 1 in the chat box just so we know, all right, that our content today is going to be perfect for you. My goal here today, if you want to move on, Haley, my goal today is to help you learn to develop leaders. My goal is you can actually have a paradigm, like how to think about leadership, or have the right mindset. You can actually have a model that Matt's going to give you to actually recruit leaders and keep volunteers, and then actually be able to grow and sustain your volunteer ministry. So that's our goal today. And if you stay to the end, okay, and I want you just to do everything you can. I know how distracted we all are, but just like 45 minutes or so, just push the phone aside a little bit and just dial in here. And if you stay to the end, we're going to do two things. One, you're going to be able to do Q&A with Matt Adair. And if you've done any Q&A with Matt, it's always legendary because he's got a lot of great stuff to share. He's not afraid of any questions. So if you have a question about volunteer ministry, go ahead and put it in the chat box now. But if you stay to the end, we're also going to give you one additional secret to getting more out of your volunteers immediately, right? Because this is about impact, right? What makes this different, this webinar, is that we're here to invest in you and to make an impact now. We're not here to talk about theory. We're not here to talk about all this pie in the sky type of stuff. We're here to give you real training, real information, real models, and things that you can do that can make an impact like right now for your volunteer meeting tonight, for your small group tomorrow, for Sunday morning that's here just around the corner. I want to introduce myself. You can see my face. My name is Sam Hill. I'm a team leader at the Rocket Company. I've been in local church leadership for over a decade, full-time staff. I'm passionate about helping church leaders enjoy ministry, okay, which is why we're so fired up to be able to invest in you. Because if nobody's investing in you, it's really hard to enjoy ministry. So that's my passion. That's the Rocket Company's passion. You'll see my family, Kristen, my 2 boys, Kanan and Marcus, and a giant, massive poodle that was never part of the equation. I never signed up for it. It is what it is. We get along. I love him. Actually, he's man's best friend, right? So that's who I am. I'm going to introduce and pass it over to Matt Adair, who's going to be delivering content today on how to develop your church's volunteers. Matt, thank you for being with us, man. Take it away. Let's do this.
Hey, Sam. Good to see you as always. Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Good afternoon from Athens, Georgia, here in the United States. Looking forward to talking with you today about 3 secrets about developing volunteers in your church. Just so you and I get to know each other a little bit, just a few things about me. I'm the lead pastor of Christ Community Church in Athens, Georgia. I've been here since 2004 as the lead pastor. Moved here when I was 28 years old, and they've allowed me to stick around for this long. So I have 20 years of experience of working in churches. I've been a church planning network executive, helped run a church planning network of more than 500 churches in the U.S. for a couple of years. Most significantly for you on this webinar is that in the past year, I've helped more than 100 churches design their volunteer development system. So I spent a lot of time and energy helping churches, from church plants to mega churches in more than half a dozen countries, figure out how to recruit, train, and evaluate volunteers. And so these are secrets that what I'm sharing with you today, what I've passed on to all these other churches, these are secrets that I had to learn the hard way. You can't spend 20 years in any industry. You can't spend 12 years in one church without doing some things right. And so I'm happy to say I've done a lot of things right, but I've also done some things wrong. And so here are some things that I've done wrong. So here's the hard way of developing leaders. This is some things that I did personally that I've screwed up that maybe you've done too, and if you haven't, I certainly want you to avoid it. The hard way when it comes to developing leaders is thinking that, thinking about volunteers and primarily what they can do for the church. Okay, you just can't do that. You don't want to treat people that way. Instead of thinking about what you can do for them as a church, thinking about volunteers primarily in terms of slots that need to be filled and jobs that need to be accomplished. Another hard way of developing and investing in volunteers is recruiting leaders with guilt. Now, I have never once told somebody they're going to die and go to hell if they didn't volunteer for a position in our church. There may have been an incident a few Christmas Eves ago where we didn't have enough volunteers, and we just told people, look, if we don't have volunteers, then we're just going to let all the kids in here and make it real noisy and make it difficult for everybody to concentrate. So you don't want to recruit volunteers with guilt. You don't want to let volunteers figure it out on their own. It's not just enough to fill some spots and just kind of let them be. Like, you want to do everything you can. And we're going to talk about this, about how you invest in your existing volunteers and how you help them get better. The hard way of developing volunteers is never letting volunteers know how they're doing. I don't know a single human being in anything that we do where we don't want to know, are we doing a good job or not? Everybody likes to be appreciated. Everybody wants to know where they stand. And so the hard way of developing volunteers is not doing that. And another way that it's really, really difficult if you want to volunteer leaders to develop volunteers is to guess at what makes a great volunteer. And so those are the kind of things that we want to talk about. So these secrets that I had to learn the hard way across 20 years of experience and 12 years at the same church here are secrets that you're going to get to learn the easy way, because this is what I want to share with you today. So, want the easy way? I figure you do. That's why you're here. That's why you're investing an hour out of your day for us to learn together and for us to help you put some things in practice so that you can recruit, train, and evaluate your volunteers to have enough of the right kind of leaders and to do the types of things that you want to do as a church. Now, let me say this up front. My results are not typical, okay? I was willing to make changes. When we figured out as a church that we needed more volunteers or that our volunteers needed to get better, we were willing to make changes. And so I don't want to assume that you're in that same place too, so I'll just go ahead and ask you, if you find in this training today that there are some changes you need to make, are you willing to make those changes? I'm willing to work hard. What I found as a performance coach working with a lot of different church leaders is that a lot of church leaders live somewhere between what I call the clouds and the dirt. We like to think big thoughts, and we could dig in the dirt and kind of get our hands dirty and execute on things, but what I find is church leaders kind of live in this middle where you don't need to make more plans. You really do need to get to work, but you just find ways in which you'll get on things like a webinar, and you'll just learn more stuff, and you won't actually put into motion and put into action what you're learning. So I was willing to take what I was learning and do something about it. So the question is whether you're willing to do that as well. I don't believe in quick fixes. Okay? I don't believe that you can just jump on a training like this and walk away knowing a few more things and that everything's going to change. So the question is, do you believe in quick fixes? Do you think that just by kind of consuming this content that that's going to make the difference that you need in order to make things happen? Or are you willing to take what we're learning here and put it into action and put some things into practice? I have a very strong why. When we worked hard on revamping our volunteer system, it was because I had a growing family and I couldn't do everything myself anymore. And we needed more people to take more parts of the church, to take ownership of different things that we were doing as a church so I could spend time with the people that matter most to me. I have a very strong why about what I hope to accomplish in our church and what I hope for the people that are part of our church. I have a very strong why when it comes to why our church even exists, and that is that we want to make the real Jesus impossible to ignore in our city and beyond. We exist for the glory of God, and so when you think about why you're here and why you want more volunteers, why you want to develop volunteers, do you have a strong why as well? So here's what I want to do. I want to kind of jump off screen here. So I know you'll miss seeing me, but I want to allow you to focus on the content that we're going to jump into as we talk about these 3 secrets for developing leaders and developing volunteers. So here's what we're going to do. These are the 3 secrets that I want to talk about, and I want to communicate, and I want to help you think through today. I want you to see that the first secret is that volunteers are leaders. All right? And then on the second secret, I want to give you a framework. I want to give you an actual framework for recruiting, training, and evaluating the volunteers in your church. And then in the third secret, I don't want you to guess any more about what makes a great volunteer. I'm going to share with you the 4 qualities of a great volunteer that we have picked up on based on research, based on learning from a lot of different churches, and we're going to zero in on the types of things that you need to develop and cultivate in the lives of your volunteers in your church, okay? So why don't we jump in and talk about this first secret, that volunteers are leaders. Now, when I talk to pastors, we just did a survey of people that we are connected with, of more than 3,000 pastors, and these are kind of the responses when we ask the question, how do you feel about ministry? And these are some of the responses that we got back. We got back responses like pastors feel overwhelmed. They feel overwhelmed because of the sheer volume of work that has to be done. Pastors feel like they can't do work that matters most. That if you're a senior pastor, if you're a lead pastor in your church, your primary work is preparing sermons week in and week out, or preparing messages week in and week out. And you find it very, very difficult to find time to focus on sermon preparation because you're having to do so many other things. Pastors feel like they don't have enough of the right kind of leaders. And we find that that's true for church leaders, whether you're on staff or even if you're a volunteer leader thinking about other volunteers, that this is the consistent type of response that we hear from church leaders. They're overwhelmed. They can't do the work that matters most to them because they don't have time, because of just the tyranny of everything else that kind of invades their schedule. And they don't feel like they have enough of the right kind of leaders. So my question for you on the next slide is, where are the leaders going to come from? Are you waiting for a busload of fully developed leaders to just show up at your front door? Are you just waiting for people to just show up, walk in the door, fully formed, ready to work, knowing what to do, knowing how to do it? I don't know of a single church that's ever had that happen, so it's hard for any of us to just sit back and wait. But the question is, where are they going to come from? Let's back up first, though, and talk about this, and let's make sure we have a clear definition of leadership, okay? Leadership is influence. I didn't come up with that. I think John Maxwell did, because I think he comes up with every good definition of things that are regarding leadership. So leadership is influence. It's not about positions. It's just about influence. Another great definition that we use a lot is this, that leadership is taking initiative. That leadership is willing to take the first step to grab at least one other person to achieve a common goal. That's leadership. And what you need in your church, you need leaders. And so while we're sitting here talking about developing volunteers, the thing that I want to make sure that you see is this. That when you think about the leaders you have in your church, when you think about this on the next slide, that what you're going to see is you're guessing and trying to imagine, where are the leaders going to come from? I'm telling you that your church is already full of leaders. And they're called volunteers. That single shift in mindset for our church here in Athens enabled us to increase the number of active leaders in our church by 800%. Simply because we stopped thinking about leaders as being a handful of people at the top of an organizational chart, and we started thinking about every single man, woman, and student who is investing time and energy as volunteers in our church, and we started thinking about them and treating them as leaders. Now, you might think that that's just some kind of funny math, that all of a sudden we just started calling them leaders and we start talking about growing our leadership capacity by 800%. But I'm telling you, that change in mindset was a radical turn for us as the elders, the pastors, the staff of our church, but also for the people as volunteers, because we helped them understand that they weren't just coming in to fill a spot, that they had a significant role to play, not just in our church, but in the kingdom of God. And what you need out of your volunteers, you need them to believe that they're a part of something bigger than themselves and that they are owners in the work that you are doing together as a church. Now let me tell you about two of my clients. And I've changed the names to protect the innocent, but let me tell you about Pastor Tim and Pastor Jerome. Pastor Tim is like a lot of clients that I work with, and the fact that his church, like every church, has volunteers, but they didn't have enough volunteers when we started working together. They were a 3-year-old church. They had gotten out of sort of the church planning phase, and now they were kind of up and going, and they had kind of hit a spot where they didn't have just this steady stream of new volunteers, and the volunteers that they had, similar to what Sam said at the beginning, were really beginning to feel overwhelmed. And so that's what he walked in with, feeling overwhelmed. He had almost no time to do sermon preparation. Like, he was scrambling on Sunday mornings, literally while the songs were happening, before he preached, to make last-minute changes in his manuscript before he preached. And it wasn't because he didn't care about preaching. It was simply because he was having to do way more work than any one person should have to do. Now contrast that with Pastor Jerome. Pastor Jerome had begun this idea of thinking about volunteers as leaders 18 months before, and it had had radical implications for his ministry. That he could basically, instead of having a job description that had 25 points, his job description now had 3. And there was not a single place in their church where they were scrambling for volunteers. They had done the hard work of thinking through volunteers as leaders, and what he found is people's capacity to serve grew by this simple shift in mindset of not just being a quote-unquote volunteer, not just being a cog in the proverbial wheel, but by actually seeing themselves as leaders. It was a huge shift for their church, okay? So that's the first secret. Your volunteers are leaders. They're not just numbers. They're not just automatons that are on an assembly line so that you could continue to produce goods and services religiously. They are people created in the image of God to influence and take initiative towards this common goal that you have as a church that exists for the sake of the glory of God and the extension of His kingdom. Now, the second secret is when I really want to get into the details here. And so, again, we're going to have live Q&A in this training, so I want you to begin thinking through questions and continuing to send them in as I give you an actual framework for how you can develop the volunteers in your church, okay? So, if you have all of these volunteer leaders, then you need to ask yourself, why is your church not doing better in terms of the amount of work and the kind of work and the quality work that you're doing week in and week out on everything from your finance team to your nursery? Why do volunteers not seem to take ownership of what you're doing? Why do they show up and serve, but beyond just the bare basics of what they have to do, there doesn't seem to be a lot of inclination to go one step further than that? And even though you have all these volunteers, you have people doing a lot of things, why do you still feel overwhelmed as a staff member, as a pastor, as the senior minister in your church? Well, here's what we found. Most churches do not develop volunteers. Actually, let me reframe that. Most churches do not intentionally develop volunteers. Most churches do not have a system. They do not have processes to recruit, train, and evaluate their volunteers. There are churches that think of leadership development, but their leadership development tends to think about staff or something like that. Rarely does it ever get down to the level of a consistent, simple, sustainable process of recruiting, training, and evaluating volunteers. So the ABC framework, what I want to walk you through here, is a simple and sustainable process to recruit, train, and evaluate every volunteer and team in your church. Okay? Simple and sustainable. Recruit, train, and evaluate every volunteer and team in your church. All right? So here we go. Here's the first part of the ABC framework. You're going to notice a pattern here. We're going to start with the letter A, all right? So if you're going to recruit, train, and evaluate volunteers, you have to attract them. This is how you recruit volunteers without resorting to guilt. So guilt-free recruitment. You never, ever have to basically pin people up against a wall and make them feel like they better volunteer or else. Now let me just give you some ideas about how to do this. 1 time a year, 2 times a year, 3 times a year. Schedule volunteer pushes. One of the things we have to do, because Athens is a university town, the University of Georgia is here, that we have a lot of college students that go to our church, and every May they leave for the summer. So we have to have a push for volunteers just for the summer. So we have to make sure that when we get into March and April, we're doing a good job letting people know, hey, here are the things that we need to happen this summer, and this is how many people that we need to fill those roles, okay? So you do a volunteer push. You have easy ways to volunteer. You make it super simple for anybody that wants to help out, for them to find out what you need help with and how they can get involved. This could be an information table in the hall. This can be something that's in your bulletin. This can be something that's on your website. Just make it simple and easy and obvious that if people want to help, if they want to just kind of raise a hand and they say they want to pitch in and be a part of what you're doing, make it easy for them to do that. Now here, this one's going to be worth the entire price of admission to this training, right? You want to sell benefits, not features. When you recruit somebody as a volunteer, it's not as much that you're recruiting them to work in the nursery once a month with 3-year-olds and you lay out all the things that are involved in that. No, you want to sell the benefit of that. You want to help them understand that they have an opportunity, a unique opportunity in the life of a 3-year-old to help them know that God loves them. They have a unique opportunity to free up parents to worship Jesus without having to worry about the safety of their kids, without having to worry about whether their kids are going to be taught the right things. That's what you're doing as a nursery volunteer, so make sure you're selling the benefits and not the features. That's the attract phase, okay? This is how you recruit people in without resorting to guilt. It's intentional, it's upfront, you let people know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how they can help. You space it out so that you're not panicked and scrambling to find volunteers because you're getting out ahead of it well in advance. Okay, so if you have questions about the attract phase, get those into the chat box and we'll answer those in a little bit. Here's the second part of the framework. This is the B stands for build in. This is how you train volunteers. There are 3 aspects to training volunteers. This part, building in, is the first part. This is how you train volunteers and help them get started. In some circles, this is what we refer to as onboarding. You don't want to explain everything. You don't have to explain everything to a volunteer. You just want them to make a healthy first step. So let me give you 2 ideas about how you can do this. Again, with every volunteer in your church, you do a simple walkthrough that whoever is their supervisor sits down with them and walks through a very basic job description and a very basic development plan. Because we want every volunteer in your church to know that you are intentionally investing in them. And that's what you do in a walkthrough. You can do that one-on-one. You can do that with a group of volunteers. If you bring a group in to work with the nursery at the same time, you have a simple job description, you have a simple development plan, you walk them through that, you answer any questions. Secondly, you make sure that every volunteer in your church is able to have an observation period. So don't bring in that brand new nursery worker and throw him or her into the deep end on week 1. You let them sit in the corner. You let them watch. You let them have no responsibilities but take in what you do so they can figure out whether or not they want to actually do this. Because praise God for people who are willing to sign up for something, but sometimes, and I've certainly experienced this with volunteers, and you probably have too, sometimes people sign up for something and then realize that it's not a good fit for them. So we want to make it easy for somebody to try something but not feel like they're stuck for the rest of their lives if it's a bad fit. So give them an observation period. Let them watch. Let them show up at a finance team meeting. Let them just be a part of what you're doing without having to commit to the team formally in that space. So you want to make sure that you give people an opportunity to take a good first step. Help them get started by doing some kind of onboarding process in that first little stretch of time that they're part of your volunteer team. Okay, so here's the next part of the framework. Connect. This is, again, is part of how you train volunteers. So you build into them and then you connect. And the connect phase is how you help them know that you care about them. This is how somebody knows as a volunteer that you actually consider them to be a human being and not just a number that needs to be filled. And so some of the things that we've done that have been very simple, but as we've done them consistently, they've been unbelievably powerful, is to have a system of checking in either in person or using texting on your phone, or maybe even a phone call. It's crazy. People do that still sometimes. And just asking 2 simple questions in the check-in. Number 1, and most significantly, how are you? How are you doing? And then listening. And then engaging with them as an actual human being. And then the second question in that check-in is to simply ask, how can I help you? So you imagine a group of leaders, a network of leaders that is investing in volunteers, that is asking them, hey, how are you doing? And how can I help you? And you do that consistently, and that's unbelievably powerful, that volunteers don't feel like you're just tossing them into the deep end. Volunteers don't feel like you're using them. They feel like you care about them and you're investing in them. And then finding appropriate ways to do one-on-one time. And depending on the size and scope of a volunteer team, then the ability to either do that at a once a month, once a quarter. For us, we say at least twice a year. We want there to be an intentional sit down over coffee, over a meal, where 2 people, a leader and somebody on their team, are having a conversation about how that person's doing. We want to make a relational investment in the people who are on our teams. Does that take time? Yes. Is it an investment for our leaders? Absolutely. But it raises the quality of our teams significantly. And it's a step that I find in most development systems gets left out. Okay? So we want to make sure that we connect with our volunteers. Right? Next, the development phase. Okay? This is the third part of training. So we're thinking of recruiting, training, and evaluating. There are 3 aspects to training volunteers. We've built into them as they got started. We're going to connect with them relationally. And in the development phase, this is where we help them get better at their job. This is what most people think in terms of development when we develop volunteers. Now, just some ideas here, and these will be familiar to most of us. 1 are training events. Now, these are usually where you're creating an event for some or most or maybe all of your volunteers to learn some things together. I think we know, because of the fullness of most people's schedules, regardless of culture and context or wherever you live, is that it isn't always easy to get everybody in a room. So thank God for technology that we're beginning to find ways and platforms where you don't have to get everybody up to the church building to train them, that you can actually distribute your information online, which is an amazing thing. The most powerful thing that we've found in developing our volunteers is just-in-time training, meaning when we ask them, how can we help you, and they tell us about a problem they're facing, when we help them solve that problem right there, we are developing them, and on the spot, when they're having to solve the problem, when they feel like they've hit a wall or are reaching a crisis point, when we help them there, we find that that's the most valuable way to develop and train somebody, is when they're in the problem and when they're actually doing the work. And then the third way that we want to train and develop volunteers is we want to resource them. We want to get the right information, the right kind of information, and the right platform and the right way for them to be able to consume those type of things. That may be an article, that may be that could be books, it could be videos, all kinds of things that are out there to do that. But that's what you want to do in terms of intentionally creating a system and a way to develop and train your volunteers. And then finally, the last part of the ABC framework is that we want to encourage and evaluate. Okay, this is how you evaluate leaders. You want to show them how they're doing. You want your volunteers to know where they stand. And so just some ideas here is at least once a year to do a volunteer appreciation event where every single volunteer in your church is acknowledged as a group. Thank you for your investment in what we do. And there's all kinds of ways to do that, all kinds of ideas that you can pull that off. And some of that is really shaped by the size and scope of your church and what kind of resources you have available. But make sure at least once a year, to the best of your ability, you create an event for your volunteers. Handwritten notes go a long way. Handwritten notes are just, it's unbelievably powerful for a volunteer to get a handwritten note from somebody that is in the ministry that they're working in, from a supervisor, from a pastor. So create a template for handwritten notes so that people don't have to come up with the idea of what they should say. Help them know what to say, but encourage them. Have a system and a plan for handwritten notes so that your volunteers can be encouraged in the work that they're doing. And then finally, find a way to do a basic evaluation. You're doing well, you're doing not so well. We'll get into to what you're evaluating in just a minute, but what I find is there's something powerful for the organization and for the individual if you have a very simple, basic way to evaluate, because you need a snapshot of how somebody's doing. They want to know how they're doing, and so evaluations go a long way. All right, so again, we go back to Pastor Tim and Pastor Jerome, my two clients, the two churches that I've worked with. And Pastor Tim, they develop volunteers, but it's haphazardly. They do tend to recruit leaders based on when they're in a panic mode. And when the nursery director comes down the hall and says that they don't have enough volunteers, and there are kids running down the halls, and things have just gone crazy and amok, and it's complete anarchy in the nursery. They don't really train volunteers because they don't have time. And the reason they don't have time is because they don't have a plan. And they certainly have never thought about evaluating volunteers. It blows their mind to even think about it. And nobody's written a note, nobody's thanked anybody intentionally as a volunteer for the entire time that Pastor Tim has been in their church, which again is 3 years. Pastor Jerome, on the other hand, began using the ABC framework 18 months ago, and what they've been able to do is to see a transformation in their volunteer culture, because systematically they have a process that is simple and sustainable, that doesn't overwhelm anybody in the entire church for how they're going to recruit, how they're going to train, and how they're going to evaluate the leaders in their church. That ABC framework is an unbelievably powerful tool that will change the lives of individual volunteers, that will transform the volunteer culture of your church, and therefore it will be an unbelievably powerful gift that you give to everybody, from pastors to volunteers, if you adopt it. If you have questions, get those in. We'll answer those in just a minute. But before we do, I want to make sure that you have a real clear understanding of what you are looking for in a volunteer. Because here's what we know. Not all volunteers are created equal. I should be able to get an amen from somebody somewhere about that one. Okay? Not all volunteers are equally helpful. You have some great volunteers in your church, and you have some not great volunteers in your church. Some volunteers don't help you at the beginning, and some volunteers never really help you ever. May I suggest that if you want to do a good job developing the volunteers in your church, growing the number of volunteers in your church, you need a process, and we just talked about that with the ABC framework, but you also need a target. If you're developing a volunteer, what are you developing them to become? So what I want to do is just simply give you 4 competencies, 4 things that you want to see in a volunteer that you can point to and go, that makes them great. So here's what they are. We worked on this for about a year, and we found that this is gold. That whether it's a 20-year-old college student or somebody who's an empty nester, someone who's in their 50s, their 60s, and they volunteered for a long time, it doesn't matter who it is. These are fantastic ways for us to focus on and point to, this is what makes a great volunteer, okay? So great volunteers are self-aware. Great volunteers are self-aware. They contribute their best to the greater good. They know their strengths, they know their weaknesses. We actually use a tool that helps them identify their strengths so that they can find the place that they best fit, and we help them find the place where they best fit. But we want people to contribute their best to the greater good of what we're doing in a church, what we're doing in a volunteer team. A great volunteer is responsible. A great volunteer, they take ownership of their work. They don't just come to bide time and to punch the clock. They take ownership of their work. A great volunteer works hard. They're hard workers. They show initiative. They take action. And great volunteers are resilient. I don't know if you ever had this experience, but more than a couple of times in 12 years of being here, we've had somebody not show up to serve on a Sunday morning because they had a difficult Saturday night. And so their personal struggle, challenge, problem, which we always assume is real, then complicates everybody's life. And so what we find is the difference between a good volunteer and a great volunteer sometimes is somebody's willingness to understand that there are people that need them and they're part of a team, and they show up resilient, tired, cranky, hurt, whatever it might be, but they still show up, they follow through on their commitments. And so we found that those four qualities have helped us time and time again, and I've seen it in church after church after church as they train to this, they point to this. This is how they evaluate their volunteers, and it's unbelievably powerful to have a target. So again, we go back to Pastor Tim and Pastor Jerome. We think about their two different churches, the 3-year-old former church plant that Pastor Tim leads, that they're just happy to have volunteers, but they don't know what really makes a good volunteer different from a bad volunteer. They do training occasionally, but they don't know what they're training to. They're just grabbing whatever just happens to capture somebody's imagination and leadership. There isn't a plan, there isn't a target, and that's different than what Pastor Jerome has in his church. That there's a clear target. They know exactly what they want to develop, and they have a framework and a process for intentionally dripping those values and that vision for their volunteers into the lives, into the heads, into the hearts of every man and woman who is serving as a volunteer in their church. And what they're finding is not only are they developing more of those kind of volunteer leaders, but they're actually seeing people walk into the church who are attracted to their church because they're noticing that they're a hard worker and this church has hard workers. That they're responsible and this church has responsible people. That they like to play to their strengths and this church values that. They don't treat everybody equally. They try to get people fit into the right places. So again, as we've talked about Pastor Tim and Pastor Jerome and the way in which they recruit, train, and evaluate volunteers, the target, the process they have in place, where they're going, my big question to you as we get ready to jump into the Q&A session is, are you more like Pastor Tim or are you more like Pastor Jerome? And if you're more like Pastor Tim, what are you going to do to change that? Because I think you know as well as I do that that's not a sustainable way to lead your church. That's not a sustainable way to lead your team. And what I want to make sure you hear me say is this: it absolutely can be different, and it can be different in the church where you lead, and it doesn't have to be difficult to figure out how to develop volunteers in your church. So there you go, guys. 3 secrets for developing the volunteers in your church.
Matt, absolutely fantastic, my friend, as always. Hey, if you benefited from anything Matt said, if it's helped you, just put a 1 in the chat box, all right? So we just know that we're in the ballpark here helping you grow a dynamic volunteer ministry. Just put a 1, just encourage Matt. Fantastic content. Haley is going to give us some questions here. I know there's been a number of questions. I've seen you come in. So, Haley, let's toss it over to you. And can you give Matt some questions here on volunteers?
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, great content so far. We have had some really good questions come in. Our first one is from Bishop, and he asks, what are the best positions to fill with volunteers as opposed to paid staff?
I really advocate most churches thinking from the ground up and really starting with trying to fill roles with volunteers and then making that shift to staffing when several things are in place. Number one, when you simply can't volunteer that role anymore. You either the skills required, you're going to have to pay somebody for those skills, or the amount of time required is going to necessitate somebody paying somebody something. So I think that you simply can no longer volunteer it. You don't have the right people, you don't have the right skills in order to volunteer. The second is that it's mission critical. We are dealing with scarcity in terms of financial resources, and so you need to make sure that you're not just hiring conveniently, but you're actually paying people whose job is critical to the mission of the church. And then third, and let's not overlook this, the money has to be there. So in terms of a specific position, it's really difficult for me to tell you what that is, Bishop, because I don't know your context. But what I would say, the principle is start with your volunteers, and then as you move further, be really clear about what your church is about and what's critical for your church. And then as you need particular skills or a certain amount of time in which it's unrealistic to ask people to volunteer, then that's when you begin to hire people and pay them for the jobs that they're doing.
Great. We've had a couple of different questions about, do you recommend using people as volunteers who are not members of your church, or do you usually reserve those positions for people who are just members?
I mean, I think it's a great way to get people to feel like they belong. And so are there certain roles that you may not want somebody who's non-member in? Sure, most likely. But for us, I don't have a problem with somebody who's not a member. What we want to make clear in that is that we want to make our expectations clear, and we want to make sure that they understand fully what we're about. But I don't know that I would require somebody who's a member to be a volunteer in every role in our church. We don't do that in Athens.
Great. Okay, well, Erin said that for her church, they still do Sunday school on Sunday mornings during both of their services. So how would you recommend recruiting people to serve in something like the children's ministry if they are then going to have to miss out on either their own Sunday school class or their service?
Yeah, I mean it's difficult, and as a church that only has one gathering, I mean there's a cost to that people are going to miss a gathering, they're going to miss a Sunday school. Again, I think what we're called to do is to find the right people who know how to cast a vision and paint a compelling picture that would make it worthwhile for somebody to give up being in their Sunday school class for a week. And so one of the things that I find when churches struggle to get enough volunteers is that they aren't selling the benefits of being part of a volunteer team. They're trying to sell features. They're not trying to help capture somebody's imagination in such a way that it would be worthwhile for them to get out of a learning environment like a Sunday school class or a worship environment like a worship gathering, and to be willing to invest in helping kids follow Jesus and helping their parents and partner with them to help them follow Jesus.
Great. Okay, a couple more questions for you, Matt. How do you encourage people to really take ownership over the area that they're serving in?
The best way to help people take ownership is to give them real decisions, to give them real power to make real decisions. Now, if you're going to do that, if you're going to give real decision-making power to a volunteer, that means that you as a leader need to be super clear about what you want, and you need to intentionally develop their competencies so that you can hand that off in a way that's responsible. If you're not clear, and if you don't develop their competencies and skills, then you're just dumping responsibility on people, and they're not going to take ownership of it. It's going to bury them. So, but that single idea changed the culture of our church when we stopped thinking top-down about decisions and we moved our decision-making structure down, all the way down to that there are volunteers in our church who have real and significant decisions that they make, that I don't make, that our staff doesn't make, that they make. That really changed the game for us in terms of people taking ownership of what they do.
That's great. Matt, I got a question for you. And the question, you said something today that was huge, okay? You said that leaders have influence and initiative. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's massive. And the reason why is because so often when we look at leaders, it's just kind of, volunteers need to just fill a spot, right? And you say volunteers are going to have influence and initiative in a church, which is huge. right? Because typically a pastor is one person, or maybe it's a couple pastors, but there's potentially hundreds of volunteers. And so you've got hundreds of people having influence and initiative in the church, which is just massive. Yep. So how important, you say things like today that you've got an A, B, C, D system. Yep. How important are systems to maintaining volunteer pipeline, volunteer growth, because that goal is so important?
Well, you can imagine that if you have 50 volunteers, 100 volunteers, 1,000 volunteers, 5,000 volunteers, that really increases the opportunity for chaos and for people to go just kind of their separate ways, or to have some volunteer teams that are really strong and others that are fairly weak. If you have a system and a process, it creates clarity and it creates consistency. And you need that in your church when it comes to serving volunteers. You want the volunteer experience to be as consistent as possible, and you want your teams going in the same direction. So you need as much clarity as possible, and a framework and a system is going to go a long way to helping you have that clarity and consistency that you need to succeed with your volunteers, that allows your church to do the work that God's called it to do.
Clarity and consistency. I love it. So, Matt is going to stick around and do more Q&A here in just a few minutes, okay? So I'm going to ask him to stick around, Matt. We really appreciate it. If you stay to the end, he's going to give you one secret to get more out of volunteers immediately, right? Immediate impact. Clarity and consistency through systems, right? How many of you, put a 1 in the chat box if you'd like to have clarity and consistency in your volunteer ministry at church? Let me ask you that question, okay? Would you like help creating a long-term, growing volunteer ministry at your church that has clarity and consistency? Put a 1 in the chat box. I love it. Look at all these. I love it. That's right, because volunteers have influence and initiative, okay? And if you've got all those volunteers having influence and initiative, you've got to create a long-term, growing volunteer ministry. And so here's the thing, okay? In the past 45 minutes or an hour or so, look, you're not going to get it all. It's just not going to happen. It's like Matt said, you've got to spend time implementing systems in your church for volunteer ministry. You've got to do it. And so what we want to do is we want to introduce to you Volunteer Rocket, which is something that we've designed by church leaders for church leaders. It's a step-by-step program, look, to help you gain, to help you train, and to help you retain volunteers. That's exactly what the Volunteer Rocket is there to do. It's got done-for-you resources, real church examples like case studies. How many times have you asked yourself, wow, I wonder what other churches are doing, right? That's exactly what the Volunteer Rocket is for. Listen, look, you're going to be encouraged, you're going to be thrilled to know how quickly the Volunteer Rocket can improve the volunteer culture in your church, because here's the thing, a lot of us don't have a lot of time, right? You may just be totally buried and you need a solution now. The thing about systems, when Matt rattles off A, B, C, D, look, he's built out a system. He's got something he's implemented, and they are living and dying by that system and growing. Look at this testimonial here. We've got all types of church leaders. David Taylor talks about how they've put together content in the Volunteer Rocket that will help them actually grow and sustain volunteers. Here's who this is for, okay? Here's who this is worked for. It works for solo leaders, solo pastors who are just on their own. They feel like, oh my goodness, I'm totally alone. I need a band of brothers. I need somebody here with me to help me do this. It's for church leaders who are in a chaos moment, okay? You thankfully have a lot of leaders, but you're like, oh man, I sure need a system here. And it's for those who are just fatigued. Your volunteer ministry has fatigue. It's hit a wall. It has stopped growing. People are burning out. They're dropping out. That's exactly who the Volunteer Rocket is for. Now let's talk about what is the Volunteer Rocket. What will you get? Well, look, it's delivered in 12 modules of coaching, okay? 12 modules, once per month. So once a month you have a module that has a coaching video, it has a listening guide, and it has an ebook so you can actually share the information with your team. What we're talking about is a 12-month coaching module that you and your strategic leaders, your volunteers, can gather around and be coached once a month on a schedule through the Volunteer Rocket, whether you want to listen, you want to watch, you want to read. We've made it easy for you to access. I want you to look and see what you're going to get. What are in these actual modules? Well, there's 12 modules, okay? The foundations of a healthy volunteer ministry. How to organize your volunteer ministry for success. How to attract volunteers. How to train volunteers. Connecting new volunteers quickly so they actually stay around, right? There's no turnstile. Module 6, inspire and engage volunteers so they don't burn out. Module 7, monitor the effectiveness of your volunteer ministry. How to accelerate, how to build. Module 10, how to coach your leaders. Module 11, how to drive your leadership system. And then Module 12, how to examine your leadership system. Total value of over $1,000. I mean, we get asked all the time. Matt does private coaching. That's one of the things that Matt does in addition to leading his church. He coaches church leaders. And we always ask church leaders, hey, who's investing in you, right? You're pouring your life out, but who's spending just like a little bit of time with you on a scheduled, regular basis so that you can actually have somebody supporting you, getting behind you? And that's what Matt does. And what the Volunteer Rocket's designed to do is to do that for you. As much as Matt would love to travel to the 300-plus people on this webinar, go to their churches on a monthly basis, and serve each of you through a one-on-one coaching session, it can't be done, right? So that's why things like the Volunteer Rocket are designed to do, is to give you something to invest in you on a regular basis, scheduled, that your team can gather around, okay? And we put together a fast action bonus today. It's our small group system, okay? If you sign up for the Volunteer Rocket, by the end of this webinar, we're going to give you the small group system absolutely free. Look at what the small group system includes. You've got a leader recruitment path. You've got 13 small group leader interview questions. You've got a leader interest form. You've got response emails, qualifications, agreements. These are like plug-and-play forms. All the things that you're like, hey, what do we do next? That's exactly what this is for, okay? You've got training. You've got Sunday morning group sermon, group sign-up forms, response. I mean, unbelievable, and it's absolutely free. Look again at these modules. I want you to see what the Volunteer Rocket, every single module, strategically designed to help you over the course of 12 months, because here's the thing. This is not going to happen overnight, right? Matt said this early on. He said there's no silver bullet. He doesn't believe in quick fixes. You look at what he shared today, he didn't do it overnight. It is systems, systems, systems. The bottom line is that we're all so busy, and church leaders are so overwhelmed, right? Matt said they surveyed over 3,000 church leaders. 3,000. Number one thing, overwhelmed. They're all overwhelmed. And so the chances of you making any changes off a 1-hour webinar are like super, super small, right? Just if we're all honest. You've got to have a regular scheduled system that you're following. Look, if all this did was just get rid of some of the anxiety of not having enough volunteers for your key events, would it be worth it, right? Just get rid of stress, right? Because Matt talked about how if you don't have enough volunteers, it's hard to focus on the priorities as a church leader. What if it got rid of the vacuum left when regular leaders can't show up anymore, right? That dreaded call. Your absolute, person, your go-to children's ministry leader, your go-to nursery worker, right? My wife works in the nursery, and when my wife can't show up, there's a vacuum right now, right? And so it's like, hey, are you going to come or not? All right, what if you could get rid of that vacuum and actually have peace? Hey, so-and-so's not showing up today. Hey, no big deal. We've got a system in place. Here's exactly what we're going to do. Let's call the next person on the list. We've developed this. They're ready to go. Or what if you could just get rid of the loneliness, right? How many church leaders just feel lonely and totally overwhelmed? And I think so often church leaders think that it's only a spiritual problem, right? Which it certainly is a part of it, perhaps. But so often, you don't have any framework. Matt used that word today, framework. You know what a framework is? It's something that you lean on so that it actually supports you. And that's exactly what systems do. That's exactly what the Volunteer Rocket is designed to do. Look, churches with a healthy volunteer base, they grow faster, they have stronger budgets, and they develop more leaders. Bottom line, I mean, we talk to church leaders, we say, what's your passion? I just want to grow. We just want to have a budget so we can do more ministry, a strong budget. We want to develop more leaders, reach more people, launch more missionaries. Guys, it takes systems for those things to happen. That's exactly why the Volunteer Rocket is designed. That's exactly why you've got 12 modules. And you can see, look, why it's a good deal at $1,143. But we've got an offer for you today. Just for attending this webinar, we've got an offer that we want you to know about. And you can get started at the Volunteer Rocket today at 70% off. 70% off. $297 at volunteerrocket.com. You get all 12 coaching modules. You get a small group leadership system. It is 70% off. I can't believe it. It's $25 a month if you built it into your budget. Guys, it's $6 a Sunday. Think about that. Think about when you show up on a Sunday morning, okay, and all the different leaders you have. You've got small group leaders, you've got children's ministry, you've got youth ministry, you've got offering plates, you've got ushers, and on and on and on and on and on. What would it be worth to you to show up on a Sunday and every single one of those strategic, as Matt said, people who have influence and initiative, how would you like a focal point for the influencers and for the initiators in your church to have something to gather around with you to follow? That's what the Volunteer Rocket is. And it's $6 a Sunday, and you can pay for it $297 at volunteerrocket.com. Absolutely fantastic. I'm just pumped because it's crazy, crazy offer, and I'm excited because of the impact it will have. Let's do a few more questions. If you stay to the end, Matt is going to give you his one secret to help you get more out of your volunteers immediately. Haley, I'm going to toss it back to you here for just a couple more questions with Matt.
Sure thing. Matt, you talked about a tool that you could use to help volunteers find the best place to serve. What kind of tool do you recommend for that?
We use a free quiz online called synergistquiz.com, SYNERGIST quiz.com. And we have every single one of our volunteers take that. And then what that does is it gives them a report that they send to us that helps us see kind of the 4 primary ways in which they naturally lead. And so this is different from like a spiritual gifts assessment because we found that it's more helpful to not micromanage where people serve, but to be really clear on how they best serve naturally. And so whether it's somebody who naturally comes up with ideas to somebody who naturally kind of just crushes a checklist in the face because they just love doing tasks, or somebody who's really good at just really detailed processes and things like that, when we know who is wired in a particular way and we know what we're looking for, then we can match that task to the right person and find that their battery isn't going to drain as much as a volunteer because we're really in their sweet spot. So that also means that we have a huge database of people, and we know how people are naturally wired to lead, and that has paid off immensely for us in being able to serve. And that, again, that's a free resource. You don't have to spend any money on that. There's some other things that you could pay for, but we found that, hey, free's great in this case.
Yeah, and we just had a question from John Lee. Could you repeat the name of that quiz one more time?
Synergistquiz.com, so SYNERGIST quiz.com. And when you fill out the questions, they send a report to whoever took the assessment. You can forward that through email. There's a book that goes with it that you can buy. Yeah, we just have people take that free assessment, and it's been really helpful for us.
Great. And kind of going along with that, how do you balance getting people in the right positions where they're going to really thrive, but also you might just have positions that just need someone to fill them? How do you balance that tension?
I think you just find different ways to communicate that we have holes that need to be filled, and so we need people to fill holes, but we want to work to do our best to get you in the right spot long term. So as I've said, nobody wants me making Thanksgiving dinner, but if you need me to stir a pot for a few minutes, I can do that. And so sometimes it's what we need. We need some people who are willing to stir pots, even if it isn't a great fit for them. But I want to invest in volunteers in such a way that they really are being served well, and that the long-term trajectory for a volunteer is, because of how we invest in you, your life outside of our church is better. So some churches will go, look, at the end of the day, we need people to get our work done. And I'm like, no, the work of our church exists to help people get developed, and that's really the priority for us.
Great. Well, last question here, Matt. What are some good tactics if you need to approach someone about changing ministry teams as opposed to, quote-unquote, needing to fire them?
I think one, be really clear on your expectations, which means simplify your job descriptions, which you should have. But I want job descriptions to almost be portable. I want people to walk around and just kind of have it in their head. So I don't need a page-long job description for a nursery worker. I need them to walk in going, look, I win today. If kids end up in a safe environment, they learn about Jesus and they go home happy. And that's kind of all I need. And so if my expectations are clear and the person is a good fit, then let's make a commitment to be honest, to assume the best of somebody that they want to help, but it's not just necessarily working, to maybe give them an opportunity to correct along the way, but when that's not happening, then don't sacrifice an entire team or an entire ministry or your entire church because you're scared to have a hard conversation.
Matt, this is fantastic. You know, I have one question because you said something, and I've been in leadership in churches for a long time. I've been a volunteer. I've been in charge of volunteers. And, you know, when you talk about this survey, and you've got 3,000 pastors that were surveyed, and they talk about being overwhelmed, and you said also they can't focus on what matters most, okay? Yeah. And I've been in that spot, right, where if you don't have a leadership system in place, you don't have a volunteer system in place, and so you're constantly scrapping for volunteers. Well, if somebody doesn't show, something doesn't go right, it falls on you, right? So you're just constantly taking on things that you weren't planning on taking on, and it's never ending. It's a never-ending cycle if you don't have some type of system in place. I mean, how important is it? Because here's the thing: when you take on something like that you weren't planning on, it takes emotional energy, takes physical energy, takes mental energy, and you're supposed to get up and preach, or you're supposed to go lead the youth group, or whatever. And I mean, how important would you say that that is? And any feedback just on that topic?
Vital, and I'll give you kind of an extreme example that we're going through right now in our church. Like, so we several weeks ago had the opportunity to get into a brand new building, and so we have about 4 weeks to get it ready for the first gathering on August 7th. And there's a lot of work that needs to get done. And so not only for me, but for our full-time staff as well, who already have full jobs, like full-time jobs. Like, there's a lot of work that needs to get done. But I will say that we have had an amazing group of volunteers, more than 50 people who have jumped in there. And so I'll speak for me that my sermon preparation time hasn't been messed up because of having to go in and work on that building. So because we have enough people taking on small parts of that task, from cleaning up a building to painting to this, that, or the other, that we're able to do this together, which is a lot more fun than just doing it on our own. And nobody's losing their mind and just stressing out because you're having to do the work of 3 people. So it just allows everybody to occupy their own space to do the work that God's called them to do, and allowing other people to do the work that God's called them to do as well.
It's huge. And everybody, for $2.97 today, $6 a Sunday, okay? You can have a 12-month, for the next 12 months, you can gather all of your volunteers together, your leaders, and say, hey, here's the plan, okay? Here's exactly where we're going to go. Here's a coaching video we can watch. Here's a guide I've printed out, or you can all get on your iPads and your iPhones. We can follow together. This is exactly what we're going to do. Your key leaders who have influence and initiative can plug into this for their respective ministries. You're going to get a small group system that today is completely free for $6 a Sunday, $297 today at volunteerrocket.com, 70% off. I'm just pumped because I know this is going to be a game changer for so many of you. Matt, if you don't mind, before we're done, go ahead and share your secret for how to get more out of your volunteers immediately today.
Start asking them questions. People who work in the nursery, instead of assuming as the pastor, what should happen in nursery or in any one of your volunteer teams, ask people for their advice. Ask people what they think about this. Ask people what they think about that, because the people in the trenches who are doing the actual work have actual knowledge and content of what's happening. And so we found that, again, as we treat people as responsible adults, as we treat people as somebody who has convictions about certain things, that even if we don't go with their convictions, and even if we don't always agree with their assessment, that they feel like they're part of the process. That's part of giving them ownership of what they're doing. And if they have ownership of what they're doing, then they're going to invest time, attention, and energy that they probably wouldn't if they just figure you're making all the decisions and then that you'll just tell them what to do at some point.
Fantastic. You all, here's the different modules that are included in Volunteer Rocket. Okay, when you're talking about, hey, what are we going to do for the next 12 months? What does it actually look like? here's what the modules cover, okay? Because there's a few different parts. If you've picked this up from Matt so far, there's a few different things that have to happen for a healthy volunteer ministry. Okay, one is you've got to actually have a foundation. You've got to actually attract volunteers. You know, you can't drive the bus forward. You can't make forward progress unless you got people on the bus with you and you're headed in the right direction. So you got to attract volunteers. Then as you attract them, you've got to have systems in place to build them in, to give them vision, to spark them, get them rolling. And then you've got to sustain. So as your church grows, as you reach more people, you got to sustain. That's exactly the way these modules are laid out. If you look at things like modules 3 and 4, how to attract volunteers, how to train them, right? How to train quickly so you're not wasting time. Then you got to talk about how to evaluate effectiveness, how to inspire them, and then how to actually drive your leadership system moving forward. I mean, it's a $1,000 coaching program for $297 today. Unbelievable value, unbelievable opportunity. My challenge to you, okay, is to get away from the Wild West mentality. That's what I call it. I used to be a Wild West volunteer leader. I'll just go ahead and out myself, okay? So I used to just totally shoot from the hip. I had no system in place. I was the rah-rah man, and hey, let me just rah-rah some volunteers. I got good volunteers. I got bad volunteers. It didn't matter. Hey, we're off to no particular target. Matt mentioned how important the target is. Here, we're heading to nowhere, and everybody burns out, and I'm burned out. Well, my challenge to you is, if you are a Wild West volunteer leader, stop and invest in a system. The reason why you're a Wild West volunteer leader is because you don't have a system. That's why, just so you know. Okay, so for $297 at volunteerrocket.com, you can have a system, literally have access to it today, and at your next key leadership meeting, begin to go through the content. Matt, I want to finish with one more question. And again, we just thank you for your time. The questions are so huge, man. I mean, people, they pour in. And somebody talked about, hey, you know, how do you get people into an ownership mentality? Because you talk a lot about leaders, you know. Yeah. And a lot of times volunteers, they just have what somebody called a renter's mentality, something like that, which I thought was a great, you know, kind of concept. And they're just sort of there doing it, right? Finishing the job and like, let's go home. How do you just kind of get people to take ownership? Because if volunteers have influence and they have initiative, like that's huge. That could change the entire direction, the culture of the church. Yep. So, I mean, how do you get people into an ownership mentality? Because theoretically, if they're going to be people that are influencers and initiators, man, you want them to have ownership and not necessarily be a renter. Can you talk about that?
First, know that there are some people, no matter what you do, what kind of investment you make in them, that they'll never take on that mentality, okay? But I would say that there are people already in your church who have taken ownership of it, and start there. Start with the people who already see themselves as owners of your church in the most healthy way possible and invest in them, and they're going to influence the majority of people who aren't going to take that first step, but they'll follow the people who are leading the way. And so you find that handful of volunteers who's already doing the work of leadership, who's already taking ownership of your church, and what you're going to see as you invest in them is their capacity is going to grow, and they're going to have greater influence, and they're going to bring other people along with them, because people are going to see, oh, this is the way in which we do things now as a church. And that's going to be as much, if not more powerful than anything you say or do as a staff member or pastor.
That's great. I absolutely love it, Matt. We just want to thank you, man, for your valuable time, for being with us. Yeah, man, I just really appreciate you bringing it. Volunteerrocket.com, $297 today. My challenge to you all, okay, if you're a church leader on here, if you're a youth minister, if you're a children's minister, if you're just a leader, a lay leader, if you're lead pastor, preacher, no matter what your role is, okay, you need to focus on the work that matters the most, which Matt talked about. What's the best way to work, to be able to focus and work on the stuff that matters the most? It's to have a system. Matt said a framework, right? Something you're leaning on. You have substance behind it. You're not Wild West shooting from the hip. My challenge to you is that if you want to focus on the work that matters most, get a volunteer system so that it doesn't all fall on your shoulders every 5 seconds, all right? And that's exactly what Volunteer Rocket is designed to do. You can go to volunteerrocket.com. Just go to the website, okay? Go to volunteerrocket.com right now and look at the different breakdowns of the modules. Look at what's there, what's included. And today, don't forget your fast action bonus. we actually have a small group system for you. It's an entirely separate coaching program that is included, that has a leader recruitment path, that has 13 small group leader interview questions, right? How many times have you sat across from somebody and said, hey, I don't even know if this person's a good fit for small group leadership or not? Well, here's the questions that you need to ask them. Here's the qualifications agreement. Here's the training. We're going to include that today. It's on a $100 coaching program for free, okay? And Volunteer Rocket is 70% off. All day long, this is $997 because it's basically like having Matt in your living room with your other leaders in your church, your volunteers, once a month, taking you through a specific content, a specific strategy to implement. So that's exactly what the Volunteer Rocket is designed to do. $297 today, 70% off, includes the fast action bonus. If you sign up by 4 o'clock, the small group system is included, absolutely free as a webinar exclusive. My name is Sam Hill. I'm a team leader at the Rocket Company. We just want to thank you for your valuable time today. You've been with us. You've been with Matt Adair talking about how to grow, how to develop, how to sustain the volunteer ministry at your church so that you can grow as a church. You can reach more people. You as a leader can focus on what matters most and not be the hero trying to save it all and do it all. You can focus. You will do ministry better. You will do it longer, more effectively when you have a system like Volunteer Rocket. Check it out, volunteerrocket.com. We will see you on the next webinar, and we promise we will always invest in you. We will bring it so that we can invest in you because we know you're investing in so many people yourself. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next time.